Welcome back, everyone. If you're anything like me, you've probably found yourself scrolling through endless videos at 2 in the morning, desperately searching for something to help quiet that restless mind of yours. Well, tonight, I've got exactly what you need. These are the kinds of stories that work like a gentle sedative for your overactive thoughts, the perfect blend of intrigue and comfort that'll have your eyelids growing heavy before you know it. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Scary stories to fall asleep to? Isn't that a bit contradictory? But here's the thing that most people don't understand about fear and sleep. When we experience controlled fear, the kind we get from a well-told story rather than real danger, our bodies actually go through a fascinating process. That initial spike of adrenaline eventually gives way to a deep sense of relief and relaxation once we realize we're safe in our own beds. It's like emotional exercise for your nervous system. Tonight's collection features tales that have been carefully selected for their ability to captivate without overwhelming. These aren't the jump scare variety that'll have you bolt upright at 3 in the morning. Instead, think of them as gentle waves of unease that gradually pull you into deeper waters of consciousness, where the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes beautifully blurred. Our first story takes us back to a time when the internet was still young and mysterious, when chat rooms felt like dark corridors leading to unknown places. This was an era before social media dominated our lives, when connecting with strangers online carried a genuine sense of adventure and danger. Sarah had always been drawn to the strange corners of the early web. While her friends spent their time on mainstream sites, she found herself exploring forums dedicated to urban legends, paranormal encounters, and unexplained phenomena. It was during one of these late-night browsing sessions in the autumn of 2003 that she stumbled upon something that would change everything. The website looked like it had been designed in the Stone Age of web development. Basic HTML, Times New Roman font, and a background that shifted between deep purple and black depending on how you angled your screen. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the primitive design. It was the header that read simply, "Real encounters, real people, real consequences." Below this ominous title was a collection of first-hand accounts that seemed too detailed to be fiction, yet too extraordinary to be true. Stories of people who had experienced things that science couldn't explain, events that had fundamentally altered their understanding of reality. Each account was dated and included what appeared to be genuine contact information for the person telling their story. Sarah spent hours reading through these testimonies, becoming increasingly absorbed in tales of haunted houses, unexplained phenomena, and encounters with things that shouldn't exist. But it was one story in particular that made her blood run cold. It was written by someone who went by the username Midnight Seeker, and it detailed an experience with what he called shadow people. According to Midnight Seeker, these weren't the fleeting glimpses of movement you might catch in your peripheral vision. These were solid, three-dimensional figures that seemed to exist in the spaces between light and darkness. They would appear in his bedroom at night, standing perfectly still at the foot of his bed, watching him with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. The account went on to describe how these visitations had started after Midnight Seeker had begun experimenting with something he called threshold meditation. This was apparently a practice where you would Position yourself at doorways or windows during the hours between midnight and dawn, attempting to perceive things that existed just beyond normal human perception. Sarah found herself reading and rereading this particular story, unable to shake the feeling that there was something authentic about the way it was written. The details were too specific, the emotions too raw. This wasn't someone trying to craft an entertaining piece of fiction. This felt like a genuine cry for help from someone who had encountered something beyond their understanding. Against her better judgment, Sarah decided to reach out to Midnight Seeker through the email address listed at the bottom of his story. She crafted a careful message, explaining that she had read his account and was curious to learn more about his experiences. She tried to strike a balance between skepticism and genuine interest, not wanting to come across as either a complete believer or a dismissive critic. To her surprise, Midnight Seeker responded within a few hours. His reply was even more unsettling than his original post. He explained that the shadow people had become more aggressive since he had shared his story online. They no longer content themselves with simply watching from the foot of his bed. Now they would move closer, sometimes reaching out with what appeared to be hands made of concentrated darkness. But the most disturbing part of his message wasn't about the shadow people themselves. It was his warning about something he called the ripple effect. According to Midnight Seeker, simply reading about these entities with genuine belief and interest could make you visible to them. By seeking them out, even through second-hand accounts, you are essentially sending out a signal that you are open to their presence. Sarah tried to dismiss this as the paranoid ramblings of someone who had clearly spent too much time in the darker corners of the internet. But as the days passed, she found herself thinking about Midnight Seeker's warning more and more. She began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. Shadows that seemed to linger a moment too long when she turned on lights. The feeling of being watched when she knew she was alone in her apartment. It started small, just a general sense of unease that would wash over her during the quiet hours of the night. But gradually, these feelings became more specific and more intense. She would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, always just outside the direct line of sight. When she would turn to look, there would be nothing there, but the impression of having seen something would linger. The first time she saw one clearly, Sarah was sitting at her computer around 2 in the morning, reading through more stories on the website that had started this whole experience. She had been so absorbed in a particularly detailed account of a haunted farmhouse that she hadn't noticed the temperature in her room dropping or the way the shadows in the corners seemed to be deepening. It was only when she paused to stretch and glance around her room that she saw it. Standing in the doorway between her bedroom and the hallway was a figure that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was roughly human in shape, but somehow wrong in ways that her mind struggled to process. The figure stood perfectly still, and though she couldn't make out any facial features, Sarah had the unmistakable impression that it was looking directly at her for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. Sarah and the shadow figure regarded each other in complete silence. Her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears, and every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. But she found herself frozen, unable to move or even breathe properly. Then Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, not fading away or moving out of sight, but simply ceasing to exist in that space. Sarah sat there for several minutes, trying to convince herself that she had imagined the whole thing, that her mind had been playing tricks on her after reading too many scary stories. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. Sarah found herself checking every corner of her apartment multiple times before bed, leaving lights on in hallways, and avoiding the very website that had started this whole nightmare. But the shadow figure's appearances were becoming more frequent, and worse yet, more bold. What had initially been glimpses in doorways evolved into prolonged encounters. The entity would manifest in her living room while she watched television, standing just outside the glow of the screen. It would appear in her bathroom mirror when she brushed her teeth, a dark silhouette that shouldn't exist in the reflection, but somehow did. Each sighting left her feeling drained, as though something vital was being slowly siphoned away from her. Sarah tried to rationalize these experiences. She researched sleep deprivation, stress-induced hallucinations, and various psychological conditions that might explain what she was seeing. But every logical explanation felt hollow when she was face to face with something that radiated such an overwhelming sense of otherness. It was during one particularly sleepless night that Sarah decided to email Midnight Seeker again. She needed to know if there was a way to make this stop, if he had found any methods to protect himself from these entities. His response came quickly, as though he had been waiting by his computer for someone to reach out. The message he sent was longer and more detailed than his previous communications. He explained that the shadow people weren't just random supernatural entities. According to his research, they were drawn to individuals who possessed what he called psychic permeability. These were people whose minds were naturally more open to perceiving things that existed beyond normal reality. The problem, he continued, was that once these entities noticed you, they began to feed off your awareness of them. Every time you saw one, every moment you spent thinking about them or fearing their presence, you were essentially providing them with sustenance. They grew stronger and more solid the more attention you gave them, which explained why the encounters were becoming more intense over time. But Midnight Seeker's email contained more than just an explanation. He had discovered something he called the Circle of Mirrors technique. This was a protective ritual that involved placing mirrors at specific points around your living space, creating a geometric pattern that supposedly confused these entities and made it difficult for them to maintain their presence in our reality. Sarah was skeptical, but desperation made her willing to try almost anything. She spent an entire day arranging small mirrors throughout her apartment, according to Midnight Seeker's precise instructions. The pattern was complex, requiring mirrors to be placed at exact angles and distances from each other. It felt ridiculous as she measured and remeasured, using a protractor to ensure the angles were perfect. That first night with the mirrors in place was the most peaceful sleep Sarah had experienced in weeks. No shadowy figures appeared in her peripheral vision. No overwhelming sense of being watched disturbed her rest. She woke up feeling refreshed for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. For several days, the mirror technique seemed to work perfectly. Sarah began to feel like her life was returning to normal. She could walk through her apartment without constantly checking dark corners, and the oppressive atmosphere that had been weighing her down began to lift. But on the fifth night, something changed. Sarah woke up around 3 in the morning to find that several of the mirrors had been turned to face the walls. This should have been impossible, as she had secured them carefully to prevent any accidental movement. Yet there they were, deliberately repositioned so that their reflective surfaces were hidden. As she got out of bed to investigate, Sarah noticed something that made her blood freeze. In the mirrors that were still properly positioned, she could see multiple shadow figures reflected back at her, not just one or two, but an entire crowd of dark silhouettes that seemed to be pressed against the boundaries of her apartment, searching for a way inside. The protection wasn't keeping them away, she realized with growing horror. It was trapping them, concentrating their attention on her space and making them increasingly desperate to break through whatever barrier the mirrors had created. Sarah quickly sent another email to Midnight Seeker, describing what had happened with the mirror technique. His response was immediate and filled with a panic she hadn't detected in his previous messages. The mirrors weren't supposed to attract more entities, he wrote. Something had gone wrong with the ritual, or perhaps these particular shadow people were more powerful than the ones he had encountered. His next message contained a single line that made Sarah's hands shake as she read it. They're here too now. I can see dozens of them. I think we may have made a terrible mistake. After that, Midnight Seeker stopped responding to her emails entirely. Sarah tried calling the phone number he had provided in one of his earlier messages, but it had been disconnected. She searched for any other contact information, any trace of his real identity, but found nothing. It was as though Midnight Seeker had simply vanished from the internet entirely. Left alone with her growing supernatural problem, Sarah began to research other methods of protection. She found scattered references to similar encounters on obscure forums and buried deep in academic papers about folklore and mythology. Most of the information was contradictory or incomplete, but a few consistent themes emerged. Salt circles were mentioned repeatedly, as were specific types of crystals and herbs. Some sources suggested that iron objects could disrupt the entity's ability to manifest, while others claimed that certain frequencies of sound could drive them away. Sarah tried everything she could find, turning her apartment into a bizarre combination of occult shop and science experiment. Nothing worked for more than a few days. The shadow people seemed to adapt to each new protection method, finding ways around salt barriers and growing immune to whatever disruption the iron objects were supposed to provide. If anything, they appeared to be learning from each failed attempt, becoming more sophisticated in their approaches. It was during this period of escalating supernatural harassment that Sarah began to notice changes in herself. Her reflection in mirrors looked somehow different, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. She would catch herself staring at her own image for long periods, searching for something that felt fundamentally wrong but remained just beyond her ability to identify. Friends and family members started commenting on her appearance. They said she looked tired, stressed, somehow diminished. Sarah tried to explain that she hadn't been sleeping well, but the truth was that the changes went deeper than simple exhaustion. She felt as though something essential about herself was being slowly drained away, leaving behind a hollow shell that looked like her, but lacked some fundamental quality that made her who she was. The shadow people were no longer content to simply observe. They had begun to interact with her physical environment in subtle but unmistakable ways. Objects would be moved during the night, always to positions that seemed deliberately unsettling. Books would be opened to specific pages that contained disturbing passages. Her computer would turn on by itself, displaying websites she had never visited that contained images and text that filled her with inexplicable dread. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in December when Sarah discovered that the shadow people had begun to communicate with her directly. She woke up to find words written in condensation on her bathroom mirror, messages that appeared to be formed by something pressing against the glass from the inside. The first message was simple but chilling. "We know you can see us." Over the following nights, these communications became more frequent and more personal. The entities seemed to know intimate details about her life, referencing childhood memories she had never shared with anyone, and displaying knowledge of private thoughts she had never spoken aloud. They would leave messages about her deceased grandmother, about the job interview she had failed the previous month, about the recurring nightmare she had been having since she was 7 years old. But it was the content of these messages that truly terrified Sarah. The shadow people weren't just observing her life, they were offering to improve it. They promised to help her find a better job, to bring back people she had lost, to give her abilities that would make her special in ways she had always dreamed of being. All they asked for in return was her complete acceptance of their presence in her world. Sarah recognized this for what it was, a trap. Every story she had read about supernatural entities contained warnings about making deals with beings from beyond our reality. But as the weeks passed and her isolation grew more complete, she found herself genuinely considering their offers. The shadow people had effectively cut her off from normal human contact by making her too paranoid and unstable to maintain relationships. They were slowly becoming the only consistent presence in her life. The realization that she was being deliberately manipulated gave Sarah a moment of clarity that she hadn't experienced in months. These entities weren't just feeding off her fear and attention, they were actively working to make her dependent on them. Every protection method that had failed, every friend who had grown distant because of her increasingly erratic behavior, every sleepless night that had weakened her resolve, it was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan to isolate her completely. Armed with this understanding, Sarah began to approach her situation differently. Instead of trying to banish the shadow people through external methods, she focused on rebuilding her connection to the normal world that they were trying to separate her from. She forced herself to maintain regular schedules, to eat proper meals, to exercise, and most importantly, to interact with other people even when every instinct told her to hide. The shadow people responded to this change in strategy with increased aggression. They began appearing during daylight hours, manifesting in public places where Sarah couldn't avoid seeing them without drawing attention to herself. They would stand behind cashiers at grocery stores, lurk in the background of her workplace, and position themselves where she couldn't help but notice them during important conversations. But Sarah had learned something crucial about these entities through months of unwilling cohabitation. Their power over her was directly proportional to the importance she placed on their presence. The more she focused on them, the stronger they became. The more she feared them, the more real they appeared. By treating them as nothing more than an annoying but ultimately harmless intrusion, she began to diminish their influence over her reality. This process wasn't immediate or easy. Sarah had to retrain her mind to respond differently to their appearances, to treat seeing a shadow person with the same casual indifference she might show toward a bug flying around her apartment. When they left messages on her mirrors, she would simply wipe them away without reading them completely. When they moved objects in her home, she would move them back without acknowledging that anything supernatural had occurred. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the shadow people began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less solid, less present, less real. Their attempts to communicate became sporadic and then stopped altogether. The oppressive atmosphere that had dominated Sarah's apartment for so long began to lift, replaced by a sense of normalcy she had almost forgotten was possible. The final test came 6 months after she had first encountered Midnight Seeker's story. Sarah was cleaning out her computer files when she came across the bookmark for the website that had started this whole experience. For a moment, she hesitated, remembering the warning about how reading these stories with genuine belief could make you visible to the entities they described. But Sarah had learned something important about belief and reality during her months of supernatural harassment. These entities fed on fear and isolation, but they also required a specific type of belief to maintain their presence in our world. By changing her relationship to that belief, by refusing to give them the emotional energy they needed to remain solid and threatening, she had effectively starved them into insignificance. She clicked on the bookmark, expecting to find the same collection of stories that had originally drawn her in. Instead, she found a simple message. This site has been permanently closed due to safety concerns. Below this notice was a single line of text that made her smile for the first time in months. Some doors are better left unopened, and so we close tonight's collection with a reminder that the most powerful stories are often the ones that teach us something about ourselves. Sarah's journey through digital darkness and shadow-touch reality shows us that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we invite in through our own curiosity and fear. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you're safe in your own space, surrounded by the familiar and the known. Let these tales fade into the gentle hum of your subconscious, carrying you toward peaceful dreams where shadows hold no power and morning light always returns.